Hey everyone, I'm live here with Joseph Stieb. Is it Steve or Stieb?
Oh, it's Steve. Yeah.
Steve. Okay. Really happy to have you here. And I'm Melinda McClymans. I'm the Assistant Director of the Middle East Study Center. And this is the Keys to Understanding the Middle East podcast. So Dr. Stieb is here to talk actually about America, even though this is about Middle East culture and context, because it's a very important connection and really a massively important thing to understand for the Middle East, which is American kind of foreign policy and specifically the war policies in the Middle East. So we're going to really dig into the kind of rationale for invading Iraq. Dr. Stieb just is about to publish a book about the kind of regime change consensus that helped build support for the invasion of Iraq in 2001 before September 11th. So we're going to go deeper into that, and really, I've always wanted to kind of understand that better. So I'm really excited to have you here, and welcome. So welcome to our podcast, and we're so glad to have you at Ohio State for a while at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, doing research and doing some great work there. I'm sure that we're going to learn about as well. So Dr. Stieb got his PhD from University of North Carolina in history, correct?
Yep.
Okay, but you also have political science degree?
Some background in that.
Okay. So strong political science analyses and history coming up. If you don't mind, we kind of are on a time frame today. We want to be timely. So why don't we just dig into the regime change consensus and what you mean by that?
Sure. So I just want to say thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and it's an honor to be speaking with you guys today. I do want to say the book is real. It is published and it exists.
Oh, nice.
So basically, the regime change consensus is this idea that during the 1990s, a sort of common sense type of thinking about Iraq formed across most of the political and foreign policy spectrum, or what you might call the foreign policy establishment in the United States. And basically this consensus was that Saddam Hussein, because he was interpreted as a totalitarian dictator and a sort of maniac in his personal psychology, was never going to change his strategic intentions, especially his intentions to get weapons of mass destruction and to dominate the Persian Gulf. So he was never going to change that, not even with all the pressures of containment. And just to be clear on what containment was, right? Containment was a policy that the United States and its allies put in on Iraq post-Persian Gulf War in 1991. So it included sanctions, included weapons inspections run by the United Nations and the IAEA. It included occasional military strikes, depending upon Saddam's actions. And eventually it included no-fly zones in northern and southern Iraq that were designed both to limit Saddam's power and to protect certain vulnerable populations like the Kurdish populations in the north. So over the course of the 90s, because of a variety of events and a variety of interpretations of Iraq and Iraqi political culture, Americans, especially in the foreign policy establishment, gravitated to this viewpoint that only the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, and that meant the complete uprooting of the regime, not just the decapitation of the regime. And by the way, decapitation is kind of a political science term for removing the leadership.
Okay.
So the consensus was the total removal of the Ba'athist regime and its replacement with a kind of pro-capitalist democracy. And so I argue that by the end of the 1990s, most people in this foreign policy and political establishment saw containment as a dead letter, right? As a policy that was kind of a zombie policy. It was still technically in place, but no one thought it was ever really going to change the situation. And so that's critically important for understanding the post 9/11 path to the Iraq War. Now, I can kind of slow down here if you want to backtrack on anything, but that's the development of the consensus. If you want, I can go later into how it affects the decision.
I could just back up to clarify. Like, so you mentioned that no-fly zones are basically a form of containment. Could you maybe clarify what you mean by containment? like specific, like from a historical perspective, or specifically to the 1990s?
Yes.
What that meant then?
Sure, that's a really important question. So, the original containment policy is George Kennan, Paul Nitze, and the early Cold War U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union, right? So the hope there was that if the United States could limit the expansion of Soviet power, all of these problems inside the Soviet Union would get worse and worse, and eventually the Soviet Union would collapse. So
Okay.
in 1989, 1990, right, when the first Bush administration is coming into power, they had all been major Cold Warriors. Right? Bush had been the vice president, he'd been director of the CIA, he had been representative to the United Nations. They all believed that containment was the reason the United States won the Cold War, right? So when we were so this is important, right? This is sort of the lessons that they derived from history. And so after, or really during, the Persian Gulf crisis in 1990-1991, they didn't want to go all the way into Iraq and change the regime and deal with an occupation, but they still thought that Iraq was this major threat to American interests in the region. And so containment seemed like a middle ground, as well as a policy that was successful against a much more powerful country. And so the hope in most containment policies is that if you limit the expansion of a rival state, that state, its internal problems will get worse, and eventually it will kind of accommodate itself to whatever you want. That's how I would describe containment. So sort of an indirect pressure strategy.
Oh, that's really helpful. That's a great, that's a great clarification, because I mean, it's so important just to understand like why we have NATO, right? And like things people hear in the news. Yeah, it's an alliance, but if you look at it on the map, it's like a band. It was meant to be a band of countries to literally surround communist countries, like, and form like a containing barrier to limit their power. Not that it was actually, I think different countries like came and left, and it wasn't like a full complete chain. Some of the links failed out at certain points, but that's like conceptually. So it was basically if you're trying to limit expansion, you have an expansionist mindset to begin with.
Yeah. It's interesting that I think the United States thinks of itself as a status quo power, but often underrates the ways that, like in the Middle East, that it transforms events. Maybe that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of just like a paradigm of expansion, like going back to Alexander the Great,
Okay.
Expanding your territories, and if you see someone else trying to expand theirs, you push against it. Maybe that's an overly simplistic way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, I think that just because the United States called what we were doing with the Soviet Union containment doesn't mean that other states hadn't tried containment before. I think that you're right, that's an ancient strategy.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, super important for understanding the geopolitics of sort of American imperialism, I guess, but then also how it really impacted Iraq and the greater region around Iraq. So you had just ended with talking about how there was this change toward change from just like saying, okay, let's limit it, Saddam Hussein, to no, we can't just cut off the head of the snake, the leader. We have to change the whole regime, like uproot not only Saddam, but like his Ba'athist cohort, like, retinue around him, like the whole administration, I guess, like of Saddam Hussein.
And the culture and the ideas of
the
Ba'athist state, right? So it's a very deep kind of thing.
Yeah. And so Clinton wasn't so much into that, but then there were maybe people who were in like a part of that consensus in Washington around Clinton so that when his presidency ended and George W. Bush's presidency started, it was kind of like loaded and ready to go. Is that kind of how it happened? Like had that changed for that?
I call it a consensus or a common sense, right? It was that the nature of this enemy, right, the nature of Saddam Hussein and this regime is that they are going, like, eventually they're going to break out of these strictures of containment. And when they do, they're going to go back to pursuing a nuclear weapon. And then Saddam Hussein is going to make another move like he did with the invasion of Kuwait, except this time he'll have a nuclear weapon, right? And it'll totally change the situation.
Wow, I didn't know that. So that's what they were talking about?
That was one of the major fears in the 1990s. So what's interesting about the 90s discourse about Iraq is that it wasn't really about terrorism, right? The pre-US invasion discourse about Iraq was all about this idea that Saddam Hussein would had the Bush administration invented this idea that Saddam or the Iraqi state had this relationship with Al-Qaeda. So the fear was that he was going to give weapons of mass destruction to Al-Qaeda. They were going to use them against the United States or American ally. And then so that Saddam Hussein would be able to strike the United States, but sort of indirectly, and that there'd be no way for the United States to answer this. But of course, Al-Qaeda would get a weapon of mass destruction. That was the great fear, the nightmare scenario of post 9/11 American thinking. But in the 90s, it wasn't about that. In the 90s, it was all about, if we let Saddam out of the box of containment, he'll get a nuclear weapon eventually, and he'll use that to dominate the Persian Gulf and to dominate the oil resources, to push his neighbors around, etc. And then, of course, if he gets nuclear weapons, well, Saudi Arabia is going to want them, Iran is going to want them, Egypt is going to want them, and it'll just be a disastrous arms race. So 9/11 is an important turning point in that respect, because it shifts the way Americans looked at Iraq from a sort of conventional strategic problem to a terrorism problem.
Wow, yeah. And that was basically because of like that is at the point, like 9/11, when the Twin Towers were attacked in the Pentagon and the flight over Pennsylvania. That's sort of when this shift happened to where Al-Qaeda came into the picture, because I actually never really understood how and why Saddam Hussein was linked with Al-Qaeda. I mean, he didn't seem, he didn't seem connected at all to me. And the faculty members I talked to kind of informally about it were like, yeah, he's not, I mean, even ideologically, like he's not really compatible, like, with the Al-Qaeda ideology. And yeah, there's really no connection there. But I guess the connection was just that he was sort of seen as a loose cannon, and there was the nuclear threat, and then somehow that nuclear threat could be extended to include an Al-Qaeda acquisition of nukes. So that's interesting.
Well, there's one person that people who want to understand the thinking of many of the Bush administration and many other pro-regime change people, they should know this person. Her name is Lori Milroy, and last name is spelled Mylroie, I think. And she was this journalist and foreign policy scholar who became a bit of a kind of a conspiracy theorist in the 1990s. And she wrote these books that were not, you wouldn't have found them at Borders or Barnes and Noble, but you would have found them on the bookshelves of all these super influential thinkers and policymakers. Like Paul Wolfowitz blurbed the book and said, "This is brilliant." Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary of Defense, major architect of the Iraq War. All these other major, people who influenced the Bush administration. And she basically argued through these very tendentious connections that Saddam Hussein was behind the mastermind of every major terrorist attack in the 1990s, with just a couple of exceptions.
Wow.
She wrote this book in 2000 called Study of Revenge. And when she basically said that Saddam Hussein is maniacally focused on revenge against the United States, and that he will risk his survival as the leader of Iraq, really his personal survival, to get back at us for Desert Storm. And there's really not much evidence for, I mean, certainly Saddam tested the United States, but survival was his priority, not revenge. But she argued, for example, that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which was really just done by a small cadre of terrorists, was a Saddam Hussein, Iraqi intelligence-backed episode.
Wow. Okay.
And so for people like Paul Wolfowitz, this whole idea that Saddam would give nuclear weapons to Al-Qaeda was less crazy because he and many of these other folks believed in this revenge-obsessed Saddam, a kind of a supervillain version of Saddam.
Well, and that's just, I mean, it's like the psychology of the situation. It's like, you that's a part of dehumanizing. Like, you see people as angry and revenge seeking, you defining them by that. Because it's like, it's a terrible mentality, really. I mean, it's like how wars are created, really.
So I would put it slightly differently. I think that one of the interesting sort of lessons that I take away from the way that Americans thought about Saddam in the 1990s is that it was really, really hard for people who were defending containment, or people who wanted to even strip down containment and, gradually allow Iraq to return to a normal status in the international community. Mm-hmm. They were at a major rhetorical and political disadvantage because Saddam was so horrible. Because if you were making the regime change argument, you seemed like you had morality on your side. You were opposed to a totalitarian dictator. And, he in the 1990s, he did do things like, he brought back branding and amputation as punishments. I mean, he's sometimes just a cartoonish villain. And so it was tough for defenders of containment to say, well, we have to tolerate this person's existence. And so the way I think about it is
I hear you. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I mean, I mean,
you see the same thing with Iran and North Korea.
I see the same thing in a lot of, I was just thinking, I don't want to get off topic, but I see the same.
Syria, very similar.
Yeah, it's like really focusing on the character of an individual rather than the big picture of this is war. Like we're making a justification to attack a country. It's like there's a big picture that's kind of put aside and just with laser focus on this individual who may actually deserve to be demonized or dehumanized, I guess, if anyone deserves it. But I mean he did attack his own citizens, the Kurds, like did war on them before the first Iraq war. He gassed villages in northern Iraq. So I mean, he definitely isn't innocent. But I guess that just makes me very nervous because that would mean any time a country has a dictator or like kind of an authoritarian figure come into power, that's somehow a reason to go in and invade the whole country, which I think is extremely dangerous.
Yeah, to say the least.
The principle behind it is what I'm trying to get at.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the principle was basically that, like having to do with the idea that he'll never change, kind of a thing, I guess. That for American, I think with these kind of rationales, it has to do with American security in the sense of we're only secure if we have powers over other countries.
Oh, in the Iraq case?
like in the case of the rationale of Saddam Hussein just being really evil and he's never going to change,
Oh,
and, yeah. So, okay. So that was sort of how the common sense way of looking at it shifted. Like in the 90s, it was like, okay, we have to make sure that he's not going to expand and God forbid he get nuclear weapons. And that's still kind of what you hear in terms of, especially when we're talking about Iran, like not letting them get a hold of nuclear weapons is the main focus. And yeah, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Like, is there still discussion of the nukes? Because you do hear about it in terms of like North Korea and stuff like that, and it is an important issue, an important global issue, are the nuclear arms that countries have in the world.
Yeah, and I think that you raised the issue of kind of American domination, and I think it's American domination and American, what you might call upholding of rules or norms in the international system are often just two sides of the same coin, and are really, really hard to separate. And I try to keep that in mind when I study historical actors. But so just for example, on the issue of nuclear weapons, I mean, on one hand, yes, the United States does not want countries that are opposed to its interests having nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, it also understands that one country getting nuclear weapons usually leads to a cascade of countries around it wanting nuclear weapons. And that's bad for everyone. So, that's one of those cases where domination and enforcing of the common good can look very, very similar.
Yeah.
And I often don't know which it really is. And that's where you have to dig into the archives and try to kind of see what's going on. But I would love to talk about the Iran-Iraq comparison, because I think that's one of the ways that one of the areas that the way Americans think about Middle Eastern and Central Asian cultures and politics really starts to make a difference. So
absolutely,
go into that direction. So that's such an interesting question, right? Why Iraq and why not Iran?
Yeah.
In the 90s, and of course, if you go back to the 80s, America was much closer to Iraq because we saw Iraq as this balancing force against the more threatening ideology of Iran, right, and under Khomeini. But by the 90s, you started to see a different analysis, right? So when American foreign policymakers and politicians looked at Iraq, they saw, or they interpreted, often because of the influence of Iraqi exiles, they interpreted Iraq as this totalitarian state where things are all power is rigidly concentrated in one person's hands, Saddam. And so it's all about what he thinks and what he decides to do. So if Americans interpreted him as a maniac, fixated on revenge, then the whole Iraqi state was going to be pushed in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But in the 90s, Americans there's some interesting documents from the Clinton archives on this. Americans interpreted Iran differently. They did see it as having a totalitarian ideology, but after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, they saw it as they saw power in Iran as being divided. And so for example, you have the Ayatollah, right? But then you also have the Majlis, right? And you have the president. So you sort of have these different power centers in Iran. Again, this is just the interpretation. I'm not an Iranian expert.
Right.
And then you also have Americans believed far more legitimacy of the government in Iran, right? There were elections, even though they weren't super legitimate, but there were elections. The country is much more unified culturally and ethnically. Iraq, on the other hand, is divided between Shia, Sunni, and Kurd, right? And that division can often become very violent. And so the idea here was that there are ways for the United States to kind of pressure Iran without having to overthrow the regime and get them to accommodate to American interests. But Iraq was seen as kind of a hopeless case because of the way power was organized in that society. And what they hoped was that, well, if you invade Iraq,
mm-hmm.
everyone in Iraq is going to be happy, except for the people who are in power. But if you invaded Iran, they thought there'd be this nationalist backlash. because the government has more legitimate or more legitimacy as a kind of an expression of nationalism in Iran. So anyway, that was just the interpretations of those two countries, but I think it helps explain these two different paths that the United States took.
Wow, that's really interesting. So yeah, I guess, I mean, in Iraq, they also, did they not have elections, or they were just sort of really superficial and just, they could only vote for Saddam Hussein? Was that kind of the?
I don't even think they had the fake elections.
Ah.
I can remember. I mean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think Syria has the fake elections, but I don't think Iran. Sorry, I need to look that up.
Yeah. No. That's a really important point, because yeah, in Iran, I mean, yeah, it's a theocracy. I mean, yeah, like ultimately, there's a council of guardians who are all theologians, and like they're clerics basically, and then the grand ayatollah at the head, and they can veto anything that's voted on. So ultimately, like they're in charge. But yeah, absolutely, they have elections, and they elect representatives. They elect the head of state. But then there's that council of guardians. So it is kind of a really unique government in the world, actually, because of that structure. So there was a perception that in Iraq, people would be, I remember that there was kind of this idea like of the American liberators going in to liberate people from Saddam Hussein.
Yes, and that is very much a failure of Americans, at least in this case, to see other societies as other societies see us, and to really fail to understand history. I think that this is really hard to bet or to estimate, but I imagine that the average Iraqi, especially the average Shia or Kurd, did not weep at the fall of Saddam Hussein, given what he had done to those populations. But, it's not like people are being polled just in the abstract. They're being polled in a real lived reality of chaos and violence in the aftermath of an invasion. And, and then you also have to keep in mind that in the 1990s, America upheld very rigid sanctions on Iraq that contributed to a major public health crisis there. Much of that public health crisis was worsened by the American bombing in the Persian Gulf War, right, which was extensive and destroyed a lot of infrastructure in Iraq.
Yeah.
And of course, just killed a lot of people, right? A lot of, of course, tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers were killed in that war. So the United States didn't really think about how the average Iraqi might see the United States, right? Whether they would trust them, whether they would see them as a liberator. And of course,
especially since we had just invaded recently. I mean, within the last 10 years that we invaded the second time. Because basically, this idea that Americans would be seen as liberators came about after we had already invaded Iraq the first time.
Yeah. And of course, the only difference there is that in 1990, we stopped. We occupied parts of southern Iraq, and we never really occupied major cities. And so that's where it became a big difference.
In 1991, we were just near the Kuwait border, correct? Like we didn't, which is sort of like, it's not very populated.
No, we never occupied Basra or any of the southern cities.
Mm-hmm. But the sanctions, you're saying, they created a public health crisis?
Yes. So, in the sanctions that the United Nations put on Iraq were very, very strict, arguably the strictest in history. And, this was part of the containment policy. The hope was that the intention of the policy was that we'll sanction Iraq and cut it off from the international economy. And then that punishment will just force Saddam Hussein to come to the table and cooperate with the weapons inspections. So he would give up all of his stuff. Saddam Hussein never gave up all of his stuff. He continued to obstruct the inspectors, and that left the United States with an important choice. Most of the rest of the world, especially France, Russia, and China, wanted Iraq to be reintegrated into the economy. The United States and Great Britain didn't, and they had a veto power on the Security Council to be able to stop it from being reintegrated. So, all these changes happened with sanctions in the 1990s. There were tons of smuggling. Of course, Saddam Hussein did not really make an effort to feed his own population or provide health care. There were times when he actually there were medical goods coming into Iraq for needy Iraqis that he resold to other countries. So, I think there's plenty of blame to go around. But, public health experts estimate that mortality rates surged in Iraq, especially amongst children. And that just wasn't in the debate about Iraq pre-2003. It just wasn't part of the media presentation of it, that Iraqis might be resentful of this.
Yeah. I mean, sanctions were kind of the go-to action point in the 90s, weren't they? Like for, addressing what we're seeing as like global threats coming out of different countries. Like just put sanctions on them, put pressure on them. It's an alternative to war kind of thing. But I mean, the people really end up paying a heavy price. That's I mean, and right now, I mean, Iran is still under our sanctions, and I think they are also having a public health crisis because it's hard to get medicine. It's hard to get anything. It's hard to get enough food, like enough protein, enough, all the supply chain issues that we're now experiencing in the U.S. because of the pandemic and other things. Just gives a slight taste of what it would be like, to just not have things on the shelves, not have critical things available, and sanctions do that intentionally. So this is all really, really important information and kind of transforms the thinking and perception of Iraq and perspectives. Just understanding that context, I think, helps understand, not necessarily, I mean, every individual Iraqi is different and will have different opinions, but like a general understanding of how that shapes insider perspectives in Iraq of another American invasion and how they probably would not see it as a liberatory force. Yeah. Can you talk to us more about these kinds of perceptions and how we can think more critically about information about Iraq or even about the Middle East in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm an American historian, so I don't have a ton of advice on who the best experts are on Middle Eastern culture and politics and society. I will say that during the debates about Iraq from 1990 to 2003, experts were definitely sidelined or marginalized. So people like Phoebe Marr, who's this great historian of Iraq, who knew about its political culture and its social issues going back to the founding of Iraq in the 1920s, but even further back than that. She testified before Congress, and so did other Iraqi experts, but they were usually marginalized by people who had more institutional power. So people who were part of think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute or the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. These people, of course, know a lot about the Middle East, but the information they present is designed to support a policy, not to inform in of itself. And they are they're based in Washington, D.C. They're much more skilled or fluent at speaking that language and affecting people who are in power. And it wasn't a particularly fair fight. There's a lot of really great work on media presentation of Iraq and kind of who got to speak. Iraqi exiles but Iraqi exiles were often presented on the pro-regime side. You very rarely got an Iraqi exile to come forward. I mean, they existed, but no one really called up Iraqi exiles to say, oh, here's the experience of Iraq in the last 10 years. There's been these sanctions. There's a lot of resentment towards the United States. You're not looking at the Iraqi regional strategy the right way, right? I think there's a great article called by Chaim Kaufman called "The Failure of the Marketplace of Ideas with Iraq," and he basically says that you just didn't hear a very wide range of ideas on Iraq, and you didn't hear from Iraqis unless they were pro-regime change.
Right.
Yeah.
Cherry picking.
Yeah. And those folks were, I think, incredibly influential. I mean, there's, for example, I interviewed a Brandeis professor named Canaan Makia. He was an Iraqi exile who was deeply devoted to human rights, very, very kind of classically liberal thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And he was actually brought into the White House for one-on-one meetings with President Bush.
Wow.
Right? He basically got to explain, like President Bush came into this situation as a blank slate on Iraq, right? He didn't know, for example, he didn't know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, right? So Canaan Makia explained.
And you're talking about senior, right?
Senior,
George Bush Senior.
No, I'm sorry. George Bush Jr.
Junior, okay.
Yeah.
So he's okay. Gotcha.
George Bush Senior, I think, knew a fair amount. I mean, he had been vice president for 8 years. He'd been director of the CIA.
Okay.
He was much more informed, and that informed a more cautious policy.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So fascinating. So this, I do. There was also some. I remember those testimonies, and they were on the news sometimes too, and very emotional, very persuasive, and things like that. But just going deeper, like into like the way we think about the Middle East, and what sort of looks and perspectives on the Middle East, what sort of images of the Middle East we get, and this is something that is highly related to the Iraq War, because people were kind of criticizing universities for their connections to I don't want to go on a tangent, but
you can.
I mean, what I'm getting at is like there are stereotypes. There's ways of seeing the Middle East, right? Like Orientalist ways that might not seem related to foreign policy, but affect our thinking, like seeing it as an exotic place, or a place that oppresses women, or like kind of essentializing the Middle East down to these like very superficial ideas about, how people are, what life is like in the Middle East.
Yeah.
How can people kind of break those stereotypes down?
Well, I'm a historian, so I would say the main way is history. We have to understand complexity, context, contingency. One of the big things I think is really interesting when you teach the history of the Middle East is to teach students about pan-Arab nationalism, right? And how Nasserism was the dominant political force of the Middle East from 40s or late 40s to the early 70s, right? And there was that was a secular ideology, right? And it was as motivating as political Islam has been in the last 30 or 40 years, right?
Yeah.
And that, it's so interesting for them to see that Islam was politically marginalized for such a long time. And that in many ways it was the failure of Nasserist nationalism that prompted this rise of political Islam. And that helps students see that this is not an essentially, that Islam is not always the dominant political force, right? That Islamism or fundamentalism or whatever you want to call it is not inevitable, but a product of history.
Yes.
And that's super important. And, it's interesting to me because, obviously the present, since the 70s, historians like Melanie McAllister have done a really great job with this kind of cultural presentation of the Middle East. And, there'd been this presentation of the rich oil sheik right, as one stereotype. And then there was the presentation of kind of the Gaddafi-like maniac dictator. And you can even see in Sacha Baron Cohen's movie from like 10 years ago, The Dictator, which I didn't.
Oh, I never heard of that one.
Yeah, he does like Gaddafi-like.
Totally have to check that out. Dictator. Okay, the Dictator.
It's just called The Dictator. It's not for
okay.
And you can easily build a view of Saddam within that trope, right?
Yeah.
But where it gets so complicated to me is that he just was so horrible. I mean, it's almost like it was easy to build in that trope because the trope was deeply embedded in cultural presentations of the Middle East. But he just fit the part. I mean, he was. I think where you should really be more, or we should be critical, is the idea that because Saddam is a villain, he's insane. Right? I think that was the leap that really needed to be criticized.
Okay.
Because he miscalculated many times. I mean, I think certain times his behavior was insane, but he was very calculating in his ability to stay in power and to separate the United States from its allies on Iraqi issues. And that's where one of the places where I think those cultural tropes helped the Bush administration make that leap from, he's a Middle Eastern dictator, he's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he obviously was of sound mind in the sense of being able to make those calculations, like, strategies and being cognizant about what he was doing and intentional about what he was doing.
Sound enough.
Yeah, I know. When it comes to that kind of like brutality, it's hard to call it sane, I guess.
But on the other hand, I think by the 1990s, he understood that his rule of the country was based mostly in terror and fear, and that there's no going halfway with terror and fear. And so, and then of course it was based on the fear of the Sunni population that if he was overthrown, the Shia population would get revenge. So he definitely played on that.
Okay. So so even though they're, we think about these stereotypes in terms of like entertainment, like sort of Disney movies and the news and stuff, they really can, like you say, help to make those leaps conceptually to justify actual foreign policy. So this is why it's so important. I'm just making a plug here for, outreach and teaching and education, because it really can affect decisions. And when it affects president's decision, it's a really serious thing. So it's not just like harmless stereotypes in Disney movies. It's really, really important to get a deeper understanding of not only the Middle East, but any region in the world, and understand our connections to that region and the similarities, both the similarities and the differences, and to, humanize and understand. So
absolutely.
Yeah, very important. And then just really quickly, you had mentioned to me in your dissertation, which was the precursor to this book, the initial, kind of structure to the book. You had mentioned, you had talked a little bit about Orientalism, which is sort of the Edward Said's concept of how the West views the East. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that affected American perceptions of the Middle East?
Sure. So Orientalism is a super fascinating concept to me, and because it's an extremely powerful tool. But as a historian, I start with the context first, and then I ask, does the theory fit this story? Does it fit this particular context? And so I pulled up a quote from the dissertation I think is really interesting. This is a article that Said wrote in The Guardian in 2003, so right when the war was beginning. And he said, without a well-organized sense that the people over there, Iraq or the Middle East in general, were not like us, which is Americans here, and didn't appreciate our values, the very core of traditionalist Orientalist dogma, there would have been no war. Right? And he said that the media in American culture presented Arabs and Iraqis as quote, irrecusably and congenitally other, and that was a key justification for the war. I kind of challenged that in my dissertation, because what's so interesting about the conversation of American thinking about Iraq in the 90s is that pro-regime change people, especially neoconservatives, almost, I think, consciously pushed back against, or at least used Orientalism in a way to say, if you're against regime change, if you don't think that democracy and human rights apply to Iraq, or they could work in Iraqi political culture, then you're a racist and you're an Orientalist. Right? They very much kind of wielded that concept. I think they really believed that. I think there was a kind of a universalistic conception of human rights, of political cultures in the 1990s, in the kind of the post-war end of history sense, that made a lot of liberals, and I'm not just picking on conservatives here, I think a lot of liberals believe this too, believe that to be non-Orientalist means we have to be pure universalists, that we have to be, say,
like saying they're just like us, so of course they want
like
democracy and capitalism. Yeah,
it's the opposite of what Said is saying.
Yeah,
Said is saying the war was justified based on the idea that they're totally unlike us. But I think for, and then when you look at the ideas of containment advocates, they say things that are much more possibly Orientalist. Like they say things like, this is a really, really different political culture. We can't, we don't think that liberal values will work here. A lot of them kind of said that this is a tribal culture, that they don't understand universalistic concepts like human rights. People like Colin Powell, he said that it's not like they're going to be reading the Federalist Papers over there, right? It was containment advocates, not all of them, but many of them, expressed these differences that I think you could say were Orientalist. So this is not a way of saying that Orientalism is not a good tool for understanding U.S. foreign policy. It definitely can be. I think it's a way of saying that it's the way it affects foreign policy is super context specific, and you have to look at not just the policymakers, but that larger conversation.
Well, and it seems like it can flip depending on what side, what do you want to rationalize?
Yeah, like most ideas, it can be multi-purposed. So
yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So basically, Said's talking about othering as a way to make people accept the idea of attacking the other, because it's like a dehumanizing effect that people, sort of accept that more easily, which is really disturbing to think about. But then also the actual rationale to go to war was more like based on the idea of liberation, and like saying, well, all humans are the same and we all want liberation, but then also kind of projecting American ideas of what living free means. So like our ideas of democracy, our ideas of sort of what an economy should look like, what a democracy should look like, and stuff like that. So it's saying, oh yeah, we're all the same, but then at the same time projecting our own self onto the other, like saying there's no difference, they're exactly just like us, like, they think about everything the exact same way. So like both ways are,
and that's where those Iraqi
lack of critical thought. Yeah, there's like a lack of in-depth thinking. Surprisingly shallow. It's all rhetoric and discourse, like rhetoric about justifying. Basically, it's a rationale, like either way.
It is a rationale
or against.
Yeah, I think it can both be a rationale and something that people really believe. So, for example, so many of these thinkers had really close personal friendships with Iraqi exiles like Canaan Makia or Ahmed Chalabi, or this Lebanese American thinker named Fuad Ajami, became really influential in these circles. And they presented Iraq in particular as like a kind of budding modern liberal state just waiting to happen, including a budding modern liberal capitalist state just waiting to happen. Like, you take this regime out, it will flourish automatically. And I think that was the ideology of post-Cold War Washington consensus, right? That neoliberal capitalism is the natural economic order of the world, that human rights are a universally applied thing. I think where you can really make a strong Orientalist critique is to say that this supposed universalism that was being applied to Iraqi voices had very little say in defining that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Other than the voices like the prominent exiles who fit exactly what neoconservatives and liberals wanted Iraqis to look like. So there's still a marginalizing going on there. It's just different.
So interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this is really great, and I'm gonna have to follow up with you on these because we've only got 10 more minutes, but I'll write something up to put on our blog, and I want to point to some of these sources you mentioned to make sure I get them right. So if people want to follow up, they can. But since we have 10 minutes left, can you just share what you're working on? Any other resources? Anything you want to share with the audience? We've got a lot of OSU students watching, but a lot of people on Facebook from around the world, could be tuning in or, on the podcast. So anything you'd like to share with them would be great.
Sure. So basically, I'm working on a second book that's about it's mainly about how conservatives have interpreted the question, why does terrorism happen, since the 1960s? And what I want to try to do is understand all the ways that conservatives in particular, but maybe possibly broader swaths of Americans in the political spectrum, have connected the problem of terrorism since the 60s and 70s to all of these other political, intellectual, and moral and cultural problems. So, for example, a lot of the ways that conservatives and other Americans interpreted terrorism when it really started kicking up again in the 70s with hijackings and the Munich massacre and all these other attacks, a lot of them interpreted through a civilizational lens, right, as a conflict of civilizations. A lot of them interpreted as a Cold War thing. Very few of them interpreted as an Islamic thing, which is interesting because that became the dominant time later, right, because it really wasn't an Islamic thing in the 70s and 80s. A lot of them connected it to crime and sort of moral disorder at home and then the changes from the 1960s that they thought had gone overboard or opposed. So I kind of want to look at all the ways that terrorism became a vector for many, many other causes and ideas and priorities, and hopefully try to illuminate some aspects of the war on terror with this pre-9/11 history.
Okay, yeah, I think that's definitely going to correct a lot of common perceptions about terrorism and just kind of, it hasn't always been so dominant. I mean, I think in the 80s you started to see the like sort of Middle Eastern terrorist character in movies more and more.
Like Back to the Future.
Exactly. Yeah. Have you seen Real Bad Arabs?
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I definitely recommend that to people who, I don't know, it's just worth watching for anyone just to see how movies were showing Arabs, like American, like Hollywood basically were showing Arabs over time, like how the stereotypes came through in our movies, kind of as maybe a reflection of these discourses. It'd be interesting to rewatch. So what else? Any other resources you'd like to share? Or any other projects you're working on? Any events coming up at the Mershon Center you want to talk about?
Sure. So we have I think I do have one resource. I think the absolute best person to look at if you're interested in kind of culture and how it affects American foreign policy in the Middle East is Melanie McAllister's book, Epic Encounters.
Okay.
Really, really interesting book. She goes all the way back to the end of World War II, and she looks at, epic movies like the Ten Commandments. She looks at ideas about terrorism, but it's all with a pop cultural focus. And she's just gets into really great detail about all these things. So I highly recommend that book. We do have some events that are related to the Middle East coming up at Mershon. We have Wesley Morgan is a reporter who's going to speak with us. Let me just look really quickly, make sure I get the date right. Wes Morgan was in the Pech Valley in Afghanistan, and he wrote a book that's basically all about America's experience in the Pech Valley from 2001 to 2020. It covers the whole span.
Wow.
He will be with us on October 7th from 3:30 to 5 in a Zoom meeting. He probably spent more time in Afghanistan than maybe any American journalist in the last 10 years. It's an excellent book. And we also have Peter Hahn from the history department is going to discuss the two-state solution, whether or not that's still viable, on September 23rd from 4 to 5.
Okay. Wow, those both sound really great and timely. So that's excellent. And I know that you're on a tight time frame, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. But we do have a few more minutes if there's anything else you'd like to say to the audience.
I think I'm all set. I mean, I'm really happy to be here. I would love to have people from the Middle East Studies Center come to Mershon events. I think Mershon's strengths are in, we have a lot of political scientists. We have a lot of people who think in terms of sort of national, international security. We don't really have a whole lot of people who think in terms of cultures, languages. In the Mershon world, we might call that like a softer discourse. It's not. I don't think that way at all, but I think that's the way it's often seen. We would love. We would love to get more connections between.
No, I mean likewise. Like I'm often asked to talk about politics, kind of, indirectly, just because we're kind of the portal to Ohio State. Mm-hmm. If people are like, what's going on in Afghanistan or what's going on in Iraq, they sort of see, oh, there's the Middle East Study Center. Yeah. And then I try to connect them to faculty at Ohio State, but we're really not necessarily focused on political science, or American security studies. We're more focused on like, who are the Kurds? Who are the Afghans? Who, what differentiates them? What makes them the same? Like, how is this region diverse in terms of language, culture, history, which I think is super important and allows understanding, like what you were talking about in Iraq, like understanding how the perception of Americans coming in was not necessarily what Americans expect. I think that's so important. So like uniting the two, I think is, that's what we're here to do. That's what universities should be doing.
Absolutely. I'll leave with one last little anecdote that it perfectly illustrates your point. Before the Iraq, so George Bush is even though he has a reputation as George Bush Jr., even though he has a reputation as being completely non-intellectual, he's known to be a voracious reader. But, okay. But I think this is from George Packer's book. I think between 2001 and 2004, so before the American invasion, he and Karl Rove did a sort of reading competition. And apparently George Bush read something like 16 biographies of presidents. Which of course I love biographies of presidents. I'm a historian, but he read 0 books about Iraq, right? The country that he was about to invade. And that says a lot. And that says a lot about the need for more study of Middle Eastern history and Middle Eastern culture.
Yeah. It's
I would read a book about a country if I was going to invade it, at least one.
Yeah, that's awful. but yeah, I think it's also just, unfortunately, very normal to be ethnocentric. It's a very, in a way, understandable orientation that, you have to make an effort to connect to other parts of the world, to reflect on yourself. Like, what does that teach you? How do you understand the U.S. and yourself better by studying other parts of the world, And that's what universities really, I think, create a space for in our society, and makes this space very important and very valuable, especially in this day and age with so much information out there. So I hope that our audience got good information over the past hour. I think so, and really hope to talk with you again soon. I'm definitely planning to go to the Peter Hahn event, and the Afghan event sounds great as well. So thanks so much again. I really appreciate you making time to join me today for our Keys to Understanding the Middle East podcast.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun, and I appreciate it.